she went, wanting only to be secret, and out from under the heavy, dark wood of the house. She found a small spot where the grass was soft and dry, and lay down, wondering how many years it had been since she had lain on soft grass to be alone to think. Around her the trees and wild flowers, with that oddly courteous air of natural things, suddenly interrupted in their pressing occupations of growth and dying, turned toward her with attention, as though, dull and imperceptible as she was, it was still necessary for them to be gentle to a creation so unfortunate as not to be rooted in the ground, forced to go from one place to another, heartbreakingly mobile. Idly, Eleanor picked a wild daisy, which died in her fingers, and, lying on the grass, looked up into its dead face. There was nothing in her mind beyond an overwhelming, wild happiness. She pulled at the daisy and wondered, smiling at herself, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Part 2. Put the bags down in the hall, Arthur, Mrs. Montague said. Wouldn't you think there'd be someone here to help us with this door? They'll have to get someone to take the bags upstairs. John. My dear. Dr. Montague hurried into the hallway, carrying his napkin, and kissed his wife obediently on the cheek she held out for him. How nice that you got here. We'd given you up. I said I'd be here today, didn't I? Did you ever know me not to come when I said I would? I brought Arthur. Arthur, the doctor said, without enthusiasm. Well, somebody had to drive, Mrs. Montague said. I imagine you expected that I would drive myself all the way out here, because you know perfectly well that I get tired. How do you do? The doctor turned, smiling on Eleanor and Theodora, with Luke behind them, clustered uncertainly in the doorway. My dear, he said, these are my friends who have been staying in Hill House with me these past few days. Theodora, Eleanor Vance, Luke Sanderson. Theodora and Eleanor and Luke murmured civilly, and Mrs. Montague nodded and said, I see you didn't bother to wait dinner for us. We'd given you up, the doctor said. I believe that I told you that I would be here today. Of course, it is perfectly possible that I am mistaken, but it is my recollection that I said I would be here today. I'm sure I will get to know all your names very soon. This gentleman is Arthur Parker. He drove me here because I dislike driving myself. Arthur, these are John's friends. Can anybody do something about our suitcases? The doctor and Luke approached, murmuring, and Mrs. Montague went on. I am to be in your most haunted room, of course. Arthur can go anywhere. That blue suitcase is mine, young man, and the small attaché planchet case. They will go in your most haunted room. The nursery, I think, Dr. Montague said when Luke looked at him inquiringly. I believe the nursery is one source of disturbance. He told his wife, and she sighed irritably. It does seem to me that you could be more methodical, she said. You've been here nearly a week, and I suppose you've done nothing with planchet. Automatic writing. I don't imagine either of these young women has mediumistic gifts. Those are Arthur's bags right there. He brought his golf clubs, just in case. Just in case of what? Theodora asked blankly, and Mrs. Montague turned to regard her coldly. Please, don't let me interrupt your dinner, she said finally. There's a definite cold spot just outside the nursery door, the doctor told his wife hopefully. Yes, dear, very nice. Isn't that young man going to take Arthur's bags upstairs? You do seem to be in a good deal of confusion here, don't you? After nearly a week, I certainly thought you'd have things in some kind of order. Any figures materialize? There have been decided manifestations. Well, I'm here now, and we'll get things going right. Where is Arthur to put the car? There's an empty stable in back of the house where we have put our other cars. He can take it around in the morning. Nonsense. I do not believe in putting things off, John, as you know perfectly well. Arthur will have plenty to do in the morning without adding to night's work. He must move the car at once. It's dark outside, the doctor said hesitantly. John, you astound me. Is it your belief that I do not know whether it is dark outside at night? The car has lights, John, and that young man can go with Arthur to show him the way. Thank you, Luke said grimly, but we have a positive policy against going outside after dark. Arthur may, of course, if he cares to, but I will not. The young ladies, the doctor said, had a shocking. Young man's a coward, Arthur said. He had concluded his fetching of suitcases and golf bags and hampers from the car and now stood beside Mrs. Montague, looking down on Luke. Arthur's face was red and his hair was white, and now, scorning Luke, he bristled. Ought to be ashamed of yourself, fellow, in front of the women. The women are just as much afraid as I am, Luke said primly. Indeed, indeed. Dr. Montague put his hand on Arthur's arm soothingly. After you've been here for a while, Arthur, you'll understand that Luke's attitude is sensible, not cowardly. We make a point of staying together after dark. I must say, John, I never expected to find you all so nervous, Mrs. Montague said. I deplore fear in these matters. She tapped her foot irritably. You know perfectly well, John, that those who have passed beyond expect to see us happy and smiling. They want to know that we are she said. Have you had dinner? Naturally, we have not had dinner, John. I said we would be here for dinner, didn't I? Or am I mistaken again? At any rate, I told Mrs. Dudley that you would be here, the doctor said, opening the door which led to the game room and on into the dining room. She left us a splendid feast. Poor Dr. Montague, Eleanor thought, standing aside to let the doctor take his wife into the dining room. He is so uncomfortable. I wonder how long she's going to stay. I wonder how long she's going to stay, Theodora whispered in her ear. Maybe her suitcase is filled with ectoplasm, Eleanor said hopefully. And how long will you be able to stay? Dr. Montague asked, sitting at the head of the dinner table with his wife cozily beside him. Well, dear, Mrs. Montague said, tasting daintily of Mrs. Dudley's caper sauce. You have found a fair cook, have you not? You know that Arthur has to get back to his school. Arthur is a headmaster, she explained down the table, and he has generously canceled his appointments for Monday. So we had better leave Monday afternoon, and then Arthur can be there for classes on Tuesday. A lot of happy schoolboys Arthur no doubt left behind, Luke said softly to Theodora. And Theodora said, but today is only Saturday. I do not mind this cooking at all, Mrs. Montague said. John, I will speak to your cook in the morning. Mrs. Dudley is an admirable woman, the doctor said carefully. Bit fancy for my taste, Arthur said. I'm a meat and potatoes man myself, he explained to Theodora. Don't drink, don't smoke, don't read trash. Bad example for the fellows at the school. They look up to one a bit, you know. I'm sure they must all model themselves on you, Theodora said soberly. Get a bad hat now and then, Arthur said, shaking his head. No taste for sports, you know, moping in corners, crybabies. Knock that out of them fast enough. He reached for the butter. Mrs. Montague leaned forward to look down the table at Arthur. Eat lightly, Arthur, she advised. We have a busy night ahead of us. What on earth do you plan to do? The doctor asked. I'm sure that you would never dream of going about these things with any system. But you will have to admit, John, that in this area I simply have more of an instinctive understanding. Women do, you know, John. At least some women. She paused and regarded Eleanor and Theodora speculatively. Neither of them, I dare say. Unless, of course, I am mistaken again. You are very fond of pointing out my errors, John. My dear, I cannot abide a slipshod job in anything. Arthur will patrol, of course. I brought Arthur for that purpose. It is so rare, she explained to Luke, who sat on her other side, to find persons civilization was in any way hampered by the presence of books. I suppose the library has been dusted. Arthur sometimes sneezes. Mrs. Dudley keeps the entire house in perfect order, the doctor said. I really will speak to Mrs. Dudley in the morning. You will show us the library then, John, and that young man will bring down my case, not the large suitcase, mind, but the small attaché case. Bring it to me in the library. We will join you later. After a session with planchet, I require a glass of milk and perhaps a small cake. Crackers will do if they are not too heavily salted. A few minutes of quiet conversation with congenial people is also very helpful, particularly if I am to be receptive during the night. The mind is a precise instrument and cannot be tended too carefully. Arthur. She bowed distantly to Eleanor and Theodora and went out, escorted by Arthur, Luke, and her husband. After a minute, Theodora said, I think I am going to be simply crazy about Mrs. Montague. I don't know, Eleanor said. Arthur is rather more to my taste. And Luke is a coward, I think. Poor Luke, Theodora said. He never had a mother. Looking up, Eleanor found that Theodora was regarding her with a curious smile, and she moved away from the table so quickly that a glass spilled. We shouldn't be alone, she said, oddly breathless. We've got to find the others. She left the table and almost ran from the room, and Theodora ran after her, laughing, down the corridor and into the little parlor, where Luke and the doctor stood before the fire. Please, sir, Luke was saying meekly, who is Planchet? The doctor sighed irritably. Imbeciles, he said, and then, sorry. The whole idea annoys me, but if she likes it. He turned and poked the fire furiously. Planchet, he went on after a moment, is a device similar to the Ouija board. Or perhaps I might explain better by saying that it is a form of automatic writing, a method of communicating with intangible beings. Although to my way of thinking, the only intangible beings who ever get in touch through one of those things are the imaginations of the people running it. Yes, well, planchet is a little piece of light wood, usually heart-shaped or triangular. A pencil is set into the narrow end, and at the other end is a pair of wheels, or feet, which will slip easily over paper. Two people place fingers on it, ask it questions, and the object moves, pushed by what force we will not here discuss, and writes answers. The Ouija board, as I say, is very similar, except that the object moves on a board pointing to separate letters. An ordinary wine glass will do the same thing. I have seen it tried with a child's wheeled toy, although I will admit that it looked silly. Each person person uses the tips of the fingers of one hand, keeping the other hand free to note down questions and answers. The answers are, invariably, I believe, meaningless, although of course my wife will tell you different. Balderdash. And he went to the fire again. Schoolgirls, he said. Superstition. Part 3. Planchet has been very kind tonight, Mrs. Montague said. John, there are definitely foreign elements present in this house. Quite a splendid sitting, really, Arthur said. He waved a sheaf of paper triumphantly. We've gotten a good deal of information for you, Mrs. Montague said. Now, Planchet was quite insistent about a nun. Have you learned anything about a nun, John? In Hill House? Not likely. Planchet felt very strongly about a nun, John. Perhaps something of the sort, a dark, vague figure even, has been seen in the neighborhood. Villagers terrified when staggering home late at night. The figure of a nun is a fairly common, John, if you please. I assume you are suggesting that I am mistaken. Or perhaps it is your intention to point out that Planchet may be mistaken. I assure you, and you must believe Planchet, even if my word is not good enough for you, that a nun was most specifically suggested. I am only trying to say, my dear, that the wraith of a nun is far and away the most common form of appearance. There has never been such a thing connected with Hill House, but in almost every... John, if you please, I assume I may continue, or is Planchet to be dismissed without a hearing? Thank you. Mrs. Montague composed herself. Now, then, there is also a name, spelled variously as Helen, or Helene, or Elena. Who might that be? My dear, many people have lived. Helen brought us a warning against a mysterious monk. Now, when a monk and a nun both turn up in one house, expect the place was built on an older site, Arthur said. Influences prevailing, you know. Older influences hanging around, he explained more fully. It sounds very much like broken vows, does it not? Very much. Had a lot of that back then, you know. Temptation, probably. I hardly think, the doctor began. I dare say she was walled up alive, Mrs. Montague said. The nun, I mean. They always did that, you know. You've no idea the messages I've gotten from nuns walled up alive. There is no case on record of any nun ever being John. May I point out to you once more that I myself have had messages from nuns walled up alive. Do you think that I am telling you a fib, John? Or do you suppose that a nun would it is a legend, a story, a libel circulated. All right, John, we won't quarrel over it. You may believe whatever you choose. Just understand, however, that sometimes purely materialistic views must give way before facts. Now, it is a proven fact that among the visitations troubling this house are a nun and what else was there? Luke asked hastily. I am so interested in hearing what, Planchet had to say. Mrs. Montague waggled a finger roguishly. Nothing about you, young man. Although one of the ladies present may hear something of interest. Impossible woman, Eleanor thought. Impossible, vulgar, possessive woman. Now, Helen, Mrs. Montague went on, wants us to search the cellar for an old well. Don't tell me Helen was buried alive, the doctor said. I hardly think so, John. I am sure that she would have mentioned it. As a matter of fact, Helen was most unclear about just what we were to find in the well. I doubt, however, that it will be treasure. One so rarely meets with real treasure in a case of this kind. More likely evidence of the missing nun. John, I cannot understand the skepticism in you. Of all people. After all, you did come to this house to collect evidence of supernatural activity. And now, when I bring you a full account of the causes and an indication of where to start looking, you are positively scornful. We have no authority to dig up the cellar. Arthur could, Mrs. Montague began hopefully, but the doctor said with firmness, No. My lease of the house specifically forbids me to tamper with the house itself. There will be no digging of cellars, no tearing out of woodwork, no ripping up of floors. Hill House is still a valuable property, and we are students, not vandals. I should think that you'd want to know the truth, John. There is nothing I should like to know more. Dr. Montague stamped across the room to the chessboard and took up a knight and regarded it furiously. He looked as though he were doggedly counting to 100. Dear me, how patient one must be sometimes, Mrs. Montague sighed. But I do want to read you the little passage we received toward the end. Arthur, do you have it? Arthur shuffled through his sheaf of papers. It was just after the message about the flowers you are to send to your aunt, Mrs. Montague said. Planchet has a control named Marigot, she explained, and Marigot takes a genuine personal interest in Arthur, brings him word from relatives, and so on. Not a fatal illness, you understand, Arthur said gravely. Have to send flowers, of course, but Marigot is most reassuring. Now, Mrs. Montague selected several pages and turned them over quickly. They were covered with loose, sprawling, penciled words, and Mrs. Montague frowned, running down the pages with her finger. Here, she said, are you read the questions and I'll read the answers. That way it will sound more natural. Off we go, Arthur said brightly, and leaned over Mrs. Montague's shoulder. Now, let me see. Start right about here. With who are you? Righto. Who are you? Nell, Mrs. Montague read in her sharp voice. And Eleanor and Theodora and Luke and the doctor turned, listening. Nell who? Eleanor, Nellie, Nell, Nell. They sometimes do that, Mrs. Montague broke off to explain. They repeat a word over and over to make sure it comes across all right. Arthur cleared his throat. What do you want? He read. Home. Do you want to go home? And Theodora shrugged comically at Eleanor. Want to be home? What are you doing here? Waiting. Waiting for what? Home. Arthur stopped and nodded profoundly. There it is again, he said. Like a word and use it over and over, just for the sound of it. Ordinarily, we never ask why, Mrs. Montague said, because it tends to confuse planchet. However, this time we were bold and came right out and asked, Arthur. Why? Arthur read. Mother, Mrs. Montague read. So you see, this time we were right to ask, because planchet was perfectly free with the answer. Is Hill House your home? Arthur read levelly. Home, Mrs. Montague responded, and the doctor sighed. Are you suffering? Arthur read. No answer here, Mrs. Montague nodded reassuringly. Sometimes they dislike admitting to pain. It tends to discourage those of us left behind, you know. Just like Arthur's aunt, for instance, will never let on that she is sick. But Marigot always lets us know. And it's even worse when they've passed over. Stoical, Arthur confirmed, and read, Can we help you? No, Mrs. Montague read. Can we do anything at all for you? No. Lost. 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 Mrs. Montague looked up. You see, she asked, one word over and over again. They love to repeat themselves. I've had one word go on to cover a whole page sometimes. What do you want? Arthur read. Mother, Mrs. Montague read back. Why? Child. Where is your mother? Home. Where is your home? Lost. 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 And after that, Mrs. Montague said, folding the paper briskly, there was nothing but gibberish. Never known planchet so cooperative, Arthur said confidingly to Theodora. Quite an experience, really. But why pick on Nell? message from that thing, Theodora said. I expect it to be about hidden treasure. None of this nonsense about sending flowers to my aunt. They are all carefully avoiding looking at me, Eleanor thought. I have been singled out again, and they are kind enough to pretend it is nothing. Why do you think all that was sent to me? She asked, helpless. Really, child, Mrs. Montague said, dropping the papers on the low table. I couldn't begin to say. Although you are rather more than a child, aren't you? Perhaps you are more receptive, psychically, than you realize. Although, and she turned away indifferently, how you could be a week in this house and not picking up the simplest message from